What's good, everybody?
I'm Jędrek, and today I want to talk to you about how I approach the Cascade Rhinos matchup with Grixis in Modern. Alrighty, so similarly to the past few videos I've put out, in this video I will focus on one matchup, in this case Cascade Rhinos deck, with Grixis, how to play against it, how to beat it, what to keep in mind, and the like. First of all, if you haven't seen the previous videos, this time I will point to the right corner. Right here, or maybe here, will be the link to the previous ones, or the previous one, or maybe a playlist, I don't know, we'll see. So you can get familiar with those. So, just like in those videos, first of all I will go over my plan against it, how the matchup plays out, and then I will talk shortly about how I sideboard in the matchup. Without any further ado, let's jump into how I beat Cascade Rhinos with Grixis. Okay, so if you're familiar at all with my content, which I assume most of you aren't at this point, the main thing that stands to me in any matchup is having a plan. And so far we've covered Hammer and Murktide in this series, and the two of those matchups couldn't be more unlike each other when it comes to having a plan. Because against Hammer, you got a very clear-cut plan of putting together A plus B, which was Lurus plus Engineered Explosives. And with those combination of cards, you couldn't really lose against them in the long term, because they didn't have an interaction against Lurus, and Engineered Explosives recurred every turn is insanely good against everything they are doing, basically. Against Murktide region, on the other hand, there wasn't really a magical A plus B combination that you were seeking, because Murktide deck is not easy to hate out, or close to, or maybe even impossible to hate out of a single piece of cardboard. So there wasn't a single card you wanted to just pair with Lurus to repeatedly sweep their board. On top of that, they have interaction to prohibit Lurus both from entering and staying on the battlefield for the prolonged amount of time. So the plan against Murktide was much more blurry, and it was basically to grind out card advantage old school way and win with whatever leftovers you have. So against Rhinos, I think it's somewhere in the middle, because you have the same A plus B combination to sweep up any Rhino tokens that they make with explosives and lures. But they do have interaction, not as efficiently and as plenty as the Murktide deck, but they still have a bunch of cards that can deal with your plan. So, as you may have already guessed, the main approach to the Rhinos matchup is to repeatedly sweep all those Rhinos, or just even put it more simply, to deal with all Rhinos that they have in their deck. They have 4 copies of Crushing Footfalls naturally, so you need to deal with 4 waves of Rhinos. More experienced pilots will very, very rarely put 2 copies of, or 2 packs of Rhinos, 2 crushes of Rhinos apparently, because a group of Rhinos is called Crush, since the name, or hence the name Crushing Footfalls. Apparently, that's what I've been told. I know close to nothing about actual Rhinos, so don't take it for granted. I just heard it. So if you have to deal with every single pair of Rhinos, let's call it a pair, because that's just factually correct, individually, it's not that easy in the first game, because you only have 1 explosives and a not that impressive number of counter spells, only 4 drowns. Granted, drown is a pretty good counter spell against Rhinos, because it will counter 1 regardless of the size of their graveyard, and if they slip through your cracks, you can kill Rhinos with drown in the lock, albeit it's not very efficient. And on top of that, you have 1 explosives and 1 seal of removal that you can recur with Lurus. This plan gets much easier post-board, or maybe not much easier, but easier, when you have more counter magic and more explosives. So as you may guess, I think the game 1 against Rhinos could be quite tough, and the sideboard matches games are the place when you can pick up some more percentages, which is usually a pretty okay spot to be in, because you will play at least the same amount of sideboarded games and pre-boarded games, and if you are a favorite in the sideboard games, you are usually favorite in the whole match, unless you are really, really bad in game 1, which is not the case with Rhinos. So, how to get there? As I've said already, as a rule of thumb, if you manage to answer the Rhinos, you'll win. Sometimes they will get you with some adventure creatures beats, be it Bonecrusher Giant, be it Brazen Borrower. Sometimes they will pair it with a Fury here or there, maybe a Subtlety if somebody's still playing the old versions with Subtleties over Furies, or a lone shardless agent that you didn't manage to deal with because you were too busy focusing on Rhinos. But those games are few and far between. Most of the time, if you deal with Rhinos, you will win. And because of that, I would very rarely, especially game 1, when my good interaction is scarce, I would very rarely expand my meaningful interaction to fight anything but either Cascade itself, or the Crushing Footfalls itself, or their protection spells when you are entering in the Crushing Footfalls duel, so to speak. So I will counter Crushing Footfalls, of course. I will counter Force of Negation on my counter spells on Crushing Footfalls. I would counter Force of Negation on my Engineered Explosives. I don't know if I would counter Force of Negation on my discard spell, for example, because I'm not sure they will have something good. If they expend 2 cards to fight discard spell, they probably have, but it's not that clear cut. The basically only spots that somewhat reliably come in pre-board when you want to use your counter magic against something different than the footfalls themselves is to fight Jace the Mind Sculptor, which also is not always true, because if you have Unholy Heat or Bold in hand, you will probably just deal with Jace like that. Of course, they will get Brainstorm, which kinda sucks, but they also will lose 4 mana, or spend 4 mana, which is a lot. And the other one, which is more common, is when you are trying to attempt a good old, or good new, maybe, Magic Dera Governing on turn 1, and you want to protect your monkey from the removal spells. Yeah, so that's pre-board. Post-board, I'm more liberal with my counter spells, of course, because you usually roughly double the amount of counter spells that you have, because you are adding from 3 to like 5-6 counter spells to the place of drowns you already have in the main deck, and you can start to fight over stuff like, I don't know, a Bonecrusher Giant on your Ludus of the Dream Den more often, or Brazen Borrower on your Ragavan with a cheap counterspell that you have, stuff like this. So that's how you can interact with them, but how they can interact with you. The most degenerate pattern that Rhinos deck can present is on your turn 3, they will Violent Outburst you with Force of Negation backup. And this is usually the downfall of most blue mages. That's how you will lose quite convincingly, and you will have this feeling of frustration, because honestly, there is nothing you can do about it really, especially, once again, pre-board. And you just don't get discouraged because of it, but because that's how it works, really. So don't just complain about it. You will take your loss from time to time like this. Sometimes you'll get a free win with Ragavan, so like it all evens each other out. The next egregious piece of interaction, especially when they are on the play, is Fire Ice, a turn 2 ice on your land, plus the turn 3 Cascade when you only have 1 mana, and you can't cast Drown in the Loch is also quite common. And because of that, if you don't want to use your mana on turn 1 or 2, don't crack your fetch lands if you can. The ideal start, if you are not playing anything on turn 1 or on turn 2 against Rhinos, is turn 1 fetch, turn 2 fetch, then they can't ice your land, and you can still hold Drown in the Loch. Next up is Dead Gun. Most good lists at this point will have both Dead Gun, Adventures, Creatures, and Furies. So try to play around them accordingly. Of course, it's not very easy to play around Dead Gun. You can't really do so because it only costs 1 mana. But you can do so around other cards to some extent with Ragavan. For example, they have Furies. So past point 2, you don't really want to hardcast Ragavan. You just want to dash it every turn so they can't tag it with Fury. Unless you are really constrained on mana, or if you have a spare copy of, or 2 even sometimes, of Ragavan in hand, you can just throw it under the bus, and they will expend 2 cards to kill it with Fury, and you're better of it because you have spare Ragavan. Another neat things about the adventure cards. A little disclaimer, I'm not entirely sure that it works that way, but it does so on Modo, and it makes sense to me. But if you're playing a paper event, just ask a judge. As always, there's nothing wrong with asking judges about stuff, so please do so. And the thing, once again, I'm not 100% of this. And this thing is that you can cast the adventure part of the card and then the creature card as well, if you lead with Ragavan. The alternative is that you can cast the adventure card and then they get to play the creature card, but I think that you casting both halves of the card makes more sense. So I would just assume that it works that way. But once again, consult with your local judge, or if you are a judge yourself, you will consult with yourself, and you will know how it really works. The last part of interaction that they can have fairly often is Blood Moon, and similarly, as I've said in the Blue-Red video last week, the best way to play around Blood Moon with Grixis is to just fetch your basics preemptively to play around it. Well, I guess the true last piece of interaction they can have is, or the group of interaction is something they don't really play those days, which is Subtlety and Cryptic Command. Because most good lists of Rhinos will just have leaner package with Fury and Dead Gun, and they won't play Subtleties and Cryptics. So if you see either of those, be it with this card spell, or if they put it on the stack, or exile to Force of Negation, whatever it is, those cards are fairly easy to play around because they either cost 2 cards or cost 4 mana, and the effect of Subtlety is much less devastating than the effect of Force of Negation. So, just if you know that they have Cryptic Command, maybe don't jam your Ragavan into it, or play Ragavan pre-combat and your spell post-combat, so they can't counter-tap, something like this. You know the drill. Yep, I think that's it when it comes to the plan, the plays, the interactions. And I'll be right back with how I sideboard against Crushing Footfalls. Alright, as far as sideboard goes, I think this one is pretty easy how to sideboard. It's pretty straightforward, or at least half of it is, because it's pretty easy to say which cards are good against Rhinos, because that's just apparent. You want something that can deal with a swath of tokens, or something that counters the Crushing Footfalls itself, preferably while being somewhat immune to Force of Negation. If you are playing some sort of Void Mirror Chalice of the Void stuff, that's obviously also good in the matchup. But let's focus first on the, I think, harder part, which is which cards are really bad against Rhinos, because that's not that apparent. And I think the easiest cards to take out are removal spells that A, cost more than 1 mana, and thus they're not very efficient, and B, don't kill Crushing Footfall tokens. So those cards are mostly Terminate and Bolt, with the former being better than Bolt, unless they're playing like a bunch of Jaces. In this case, I still think Terminate is better because you have Unholy Hit to deal with Jace, and a bunch of counter magic. So Bolt comes out first. It's probably the weakest card you have in your deck against them. Then Terminates. The first copy of Colagan's Command is almost in every matchup that it's not impressive in a card you can cut. I rarely go below 2 copies, even post-board, against decks that seemingly have no good targets for it, because recurring your creatures is a pretty vital part of the strategy. And then finally, Cling to Dust. Once again, free life usually does not matter that much. Sometimes it will, but not enough to justify it. And getting some like small card advantage that just accumulates every couple turns, or the incremental card advantage, that's what I was looking for, is also not that great. Plus, they don't use their graveyard almost at all. Some versions plays Murktide Regent, but it's not enough by a wide margin to justify Cling to Dust. So that leaves you with 3 bolts, 2 terminates, 1 Colagan's Command, and 1 Cling to Dust in the most recent list that I have, which is 7 slots. And then, if you have less than 7 good cards against Rhinos, you can just leave in some Colagan's Commands, maybe Cling to Dust. If you have more than that to bring in, then you can probably cut in Unholy Hit as well. Maybe, I don't know, if you have more than 8 for some reason, maybe you can cast First Iteration because it's kind of awkward to cast. But yeah, that's about it. As far as good cards go, I already mentioned most of them. So EE, especially with Lurus, very strong tool against the deck. Any counter magic and discard basically. As long as it's somewhat cheap. For example, Mystical Dispute is okay because it's good in tandem with other interaction to protect your interaction, but it's not great since it can't counter the Rhinos themselves for 1 mana. But stuff like Counterspell, stuff like, most importantly, Flusterstorm. Flusterstorm is probably the single best card against them that you can play out of the sideboard in the interaction department, just because it counters Crushing Footfalls through Force of Negation or their own disputes, since it has a storm the storm mechanic. Then another card that's kind of interesting is Invasive Surgery. That's one is pretty obscure, so I will put it on a screen for you just now. And I will also tell you what it does. It's for 1 mana, 1 blue mana, and an instant that counters target sorcery spell. And if you have Delirium, instead of countering it, you exile it, and you counter it, and then you search their hand, graveyard, library for as many copies as you can find of the set sorcery you countered, and exile all of them. So this is a card that's almost always worse than Flusterstorm against them. Or, well, it has higher ceiling than Flusterstorm, but lower floor because it's not great against Force of Negation. It's a card that might be in your sideboard, for example, if there are a lot of creativity decks going around. Because if you manage to counter their creativity with Delirium, you can just get rid of all of those, and their deck is much less threatening than it was before. Or it's a card that maybe is good in 1 copy against other Expressive Iteration decks, because getting rid of all iterations is pretty strong. Anyways, if for some reason you have some copies of Invasive Surgery in your sideboard, it's also a good card against Crushing Footfalls. And I think one copy might end up in some of my sideboards. If you want to target specifically Rhinos, as I've said, Flusterstorm is better. Or at least a few first copies of Flusterstorm is better. I think the first copy of Surgery versus the third copy of Flusterstorm is kinda close. But I'm not sure about it, so don't quote me on that. Maybe if you just pack 4 Flusterstorms into your sideboard, you can't go very wrong with it. But yeah, something to keep in mind. That is Invasive Surgery, interesting card. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, discard and any anti-cascade cards that you have, like Chalice of the Void, Void Mirror, if you're splashing white for some reason, Lavinia, the Azorius Renegade, I think she's called. And yeah, I think that's about it. I can't really think of any other card that's really good against Rhinos. If for some reason you have Archmage's Charm in your deck, it's okay, because it's like you are dealing with a whole... It costs 3 mana, but you are dealing with the both Rhinos, either on the stack countering it, or after it resolves you can steal one of them and they will just trade off if they don't have a removal effect for it. Yeah, I think that's it. So I'm really glad that if you like those videos, let me know either in the comments if you like this type of content, or at my Discord if you are my Patreon or my Twitch subscriber. If you're not either of those, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description down below, alongside with my other socials. There's Twitter, there's Twitch, and I stream Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays from roughly 1 p.m. European. There's also a link to my most recent version of Grixis in there. The short remark on this one. At the time I'm recording the video, the list that I'm gonna have in the link has like 4 cards in the sideboard that I'm still not sure about, and I'm just testing different versions, different configurations of my sideboard. I think the main deck is pretty much set at this point. There are like maybe 1 or 2 cards at the most that I will consider changing, but the sideboard is still can obviously vary really much depending on the metagame. So yeah, you can check all of those out in the links down below. That's it for me today. Have a lovely weekend, and as always, happy Lurusing. Take care.